It's a privilege to share God's word at DUMC, and especially in the context of Malaysia Day, which is September 16th. You will notice, I think this is one of the first times when I'm preaching in DUMC, that I have a fantastic PowerPoint, quite colorful, and this is done by DUMC media team. Let's give them a hand. Now, I suggested a Malaysian flag, but they came up with a better tagline, Vision for Malaysia and the Bunga Raya, and that has great symbolism to Malaysia Day as well. Like the flag, the Bunga Raya, which is our national flower, also symbolizes the 5 principles of the Rukun Negara. And I know as kids when we were in school, and I think parents would remind their children about this, but it's ideology or principles by which our nation as a whole, in the post-May 13 period, when the government took up this principle of the Rukun Negara, that will govern our relationship together as Malaysians. And the 5 principles stand out for belief in God, loyalty to king and country, supremacy of the Constitution, fourthly, rule of law, and 5th, courtesy and morality. Now, as we think of what is our vision for Malaysia and where do we go from here, where have we come from, I think it's important for us to reflect on the Rukun Negara, reflect on Malaysia Day. Now, we all know that Malaysia was formed on September 16, 1963, and this is a coming together of the Federation of Malaya, the 2 Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak, and Singapore. But we know our history, and Singapore left in 1965. But there is the constant struggle for both Sabahans and Sarawakians with those of us in the peninsula. Because the question often is Sabah and Sarawak 1 out of 3, which then means it's Peninsular Malaysia, Sabah and Sarawak. There are 3 entities. Or there are 13 entities. It's one of the many states. And this is a constant struggle with Sabahans and Sarawakians in the formation of Malaysia, and also the way the federal constitution was first written out in 1963 and the subsequent amendments that made. I made a slip. It's not a prophetic slip. I put 4 federal territories. Actually, there are only 3, so you need to correct it. And within this context, for those of us on the peninsular side, Merdeka, or August 31st, 1957, is very significant. But in the context of Sabah and Sarawak, then the 51 years of Malaysia is very significant. So where do we lay the emphasis? Some historians say both parts. Some focus much more on 1957, and Sabahan Sarawakians feel left out because they don't share the 1957 history. So it's very important for us at this point in our history to have a good understanding of history. I know if you are a science student and specializing in mathematics, physics, and things like that, people tend to ignore history. But a lot of our contestation today is on the understanding of history. And even as recent as a few weeks ago, the question of who fought for the independence of Malaysia. Is it just one community? Was it all communities that negotiated? And that's coming from history. The writing of history, the rewriting of history, the interpretation of history, and also in the context of politics, in the context of contemporary issues. We need to have a good understanding, a good grappling of these, not just that we would be more effective in our prayer, in our intercession for the nation, but also to serve the nation better as responsible citizens. And that's why I took this theme, the theme of vision for Malaysia. And I have 3 parts to this sermon, which starts off with vision and the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about vision? And the 2 verses that come out very strongly, and there are a number of other verses as well. But the first one is Proverbs chapter 29, verse 18, where there is no vision, the people perish. Where there is no vision, the people perish. And if you actually reflect on management training, companies, organizations, they always try to work out what is their vision, what is their mission, what are their strategies, how they're going about it, because they want to have a focus of what is it that is our vision, and our mission as a people. And the Bible itself says that if the people don't have a vision, they will eventually perish, and that comes out. And the Joel passage, Joel chapter 2, verse 28, I will pour out my spirit on all people, which is then reflected on the day of Pentecost, and this reference is made. Your sons and daughters will prophesy, your old men will dream dreams. But in the dream center, even young people can dream dreams, okay? But the prophetic utterance is that old people will dream dreams and young men will see visions. So why is it old people will see dreams and young people will see visions? Possibly young people got a whole life ahead of them to see the fulfillment of that vision. But it's important then that part of our spiritual experience and our faith experience is actually dreaming and seeing visions. It's part of spirituality and faith. And both the Old and the New Testament have this. I remember as a young boy, my father would always scold me, don't daydream, He'd say, study, don't be dreaming, work hard. These were the themes. But here the biblical sort of thought, training, how to dream dreams that will actually have revelation of God's word. And whether it's Joseph, whether it's Daniel, they dreamed, they saw visions, they were able to interpret it. And it's part of spirituality. And possibly the Dream Center could have a certificate or diploma course on how to dream, not daydreaming, but spiritual dreaming to understand God's word. Now, when I was preparing on the vision and the Bible, I took all the verses in the Bible that had the word vision in it. And it's quite easy to do now with computer, even a Google search. Vision in the Bible will bring all the verses out. And as I read these verses, I could group them into 3 parts. And this is what I have tried to do, and then try and relate it to the vision for Malaysia. Firstly, vision as a revelation or prophetic utterance from God. That means there is a prophetic utterance, as it might be, from the vision that one sees. And the passage in Numbers chapter 12, verse 6, brings this theme out. There is a contestation on the leadership of Moses. Does God only speak through Moses? And the 2 people who are challenging Moses' leadership and his prophetic utterance were no other than his own brother Aaron and the sister Miriam, who were challenging this. And then God intervenes and speaks to them. And this is what we read of in verse 6. When a prophet of the Lord is among you, I reveal myself to him in visions, I speak to him in dreams. But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? So here is the prophetic utterance. It's a revelation from God. The prophet would speak, being inspired by God through vision or through dream or direct revelation, as in the case of Moses. So a prophetic utterance coming through vision. Vision also is described in the Bible as an appearance or images or appearance of angelic beings who are then communicating it, and one sees this. Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 to 9 brings this theme out. Matthew 17, verses 1 to 9. And the context here is actually Peter, James, and John up with Jesus on the mount where there is the scene of the transfiguration. And in that context, there is a vision that they see of Moses and Elijah. So it's part of a vision, a supernatural manifestation that takes place at that time. I think the most classic examples of vision appearances was in the context of Paul's own conversion. In Acts chapter 9, Paul is blinded by light or vision that he sees. Paul's own conversion experience and the vision and the message that comes to Ananias and to restore the eyes of the sight for Paul. And these come in the form of a vision and communication directly from God in that context. Both the book of Daniel and the book of Revelations have lots of images. And I like the one in Revelation chapter 19. Not all of us ride horses and things like that, but John in the Revelation passage has a vision. I saw the Revelations chapter 19, verse 11. I saw the heavens standing open, and there before me was a white horse whose rider is called Faithful and True. With justice he judges and makes war. So it's a vision of a horse. It's a kind of revelation of God's message that is coming to the people, and the New Testament writer or the Old Testament prophet sees this vision. He then interprets it to the people, and their faith is strengthened, and so vision comes in that form. The third way that I see vision is used in this context is vision as revealed in the Word of God. It's God's Word given, and in this case, the Deuteronomy book that our church has been studying, and I looked at the first 15 chapters to see, is there a vision for the society God was establishing? Are there some principles that we can draw from the first 15 chapters on building a society? And I came up with 7 principles of God for a society, which has relevance today, some of which is already in laws and handed down to societies and nations. So it's revealed in the Word of God that through Moses and the record of God's Word, this vision for society is clear. And so what are the 7 principles? Because God was setting up his community of people on earth. They were going into the promised land. What were basic principles? We must recognize at that point in time, there was no such thing as democracy or a constitution. There were laws, there were a set of principles that they have to abide by. There was no general election and registering of voters in the current democratic tradition. It was a system of monarchy, or there were leaders, there were tribal communities of the different tribes of Israel, and there was some leadership structure and social order of that day. So the 7 principles, the first principle is on the selection of leaders and leadership competencies. Selection of leaders and leadership competencies. And this biblical principle is not only relevant then, but it's also relevant to us even here and now. So how do we appoint leaders? Who are the leaders of the nation today? It could be at the federal level, it could be at the state level, it could be at local government level. They are elected, they are appointed from the political side, or they could be civil servants or responsible for the administration of the state, the nation, or the government. So what kind of leaders was God saying the people should choose? And this is what the verses bring out to us in Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 12 and 13. Because the people as a community will have problems, and somebody will have to resolve them. Somebody would have to guide, somebody would have to lead. Verse 12, but how can I bear your problems and your burdens and your dispute all by myself? The big society tends to have grievances, there are problems, and you need some system of managing people and the situation and governance. And this is what is written for us in verse 13. Choose some wise, that means choose people who are wise. Wisdom is something different from knowledge. Knowledge could be acquired, you could be trained, but wisdom comes with maturity and experience. People who are wise, people who have understanding, people who are respected. That means society respects them. Society sees them as people with integrity or with morality. They have respect in that context. So it's not just a person is a leader because he's close to A or B, or is personally selected in the way, or he pays and gets into a position or what. But wise, someone with understanding, someone with respect. And there also needs to be representation. It says from each of your tribes. So there's a kind of representation to the community or community groupings. Of course, for Indians and Chinese here, there are no tribes. We might have sub-ethnic groups. But for natives of Sabah and Sarawak, Orang Asli communities, they have distinctive native groups or sub-ethnic groups. And even among the Chinese community and Indian community, we might think all are homogeneous, but there are differences in the linguistic groups or cultural groups or the historical background of these communities. So leadership in that. And so verse 15 says, I took the leading men of your tribes, wise and respected, and appointed them to have authority. And then this kind of breakdown from large numbers to smaller units so that there is leadership and management of the community. So one thing that's coming out for a vision that the Bible is saying, and the vision for a society or a nation, is the type of leaders. Who are the leaders that the nation needs? Who are the people who will govern and lead? That's the first point that comes out to us. The second point that comes out from the Deuteronomy passage as a principle of God is the appointment of judges and the justice system. Now, this is not a democracy in the Old Testament. It was more monarchy and theocracy in which God had a direct hand in the governance of the nation of that time. But the principle stands out. What is the principle for a judge? Which also links to leadership, and that comes out in verse 17. Do not show partiality in judging. Here both small and great alike. Do not be afraid of any man, for judgment belongs to God. Earlier in verse 16, we see, "And I charge your judges at this time, hear the disputes between your brothers and judge fairly." So fairness is a fundamental principle. Fairness, justice, impartiality. The judge should judge without fear of intimidation of any kind. Because in this passage, ultimately, the human judge will face the greatest judge of all on the judgment day. So that's the fear that governs the leader and the judge on earth. And this is a principle. This principle is not just for the Deuteronomy people. It's not just for the people in the Old Testament. It's for the people here and now. Because this principle of justice, impartiality, independence, separation in governance is central to most systems of governance today. And this comes out to us in what the Bible is then calling for a vision of our country. Thirdly is the universal moral code for society. Now, we all are familiar with the Ten Commandments, so I'll not go through them. But the Ten Commandments brings certain uncompromisable principles on managing society. Now, the first three of the Ten Commandments is more God-centered and about idolatry, about God, taking the name of God in vain. But the other seven relate to human relationships in the way we relate to one another and how we manage society. And Sabbath is central. So there is working time and there is off time, there is day of rest, and this is governed by labor laws as well. You can have this principle of overtime, you can work on public holidays and so forth, but there is cut-off periods in terms of how much the workplace can demand on the worker, and the worker needs to have a more balanced life, as it were. So rest, honoring parents, the issue of murder, the issue of adultery, the issue of stealing, the issue of false testimony, the issue of covetousness, which comes from the Ten Commandments, are principles that are then translated in criminal procedure codes, whether it's the penal code in our country or other laws that have been enacted to look at issues of murder. Of course, honoring parents is not legislated. I think if you abuse, there are some people who want, if you neglect your parents and don't care of your parents, children should be held responsible. But parents are held responsible if they abuse their child. And most countries and conventions have brought that theme. But there is a universal code. Now, what we are looking at is, if this is the vision of God, what is the vision for Malaysia, and to what extent do we conform to the standards of the Ten Commandments? Is our judicial and justice system, is actually the criminals being charged or innocent people being charged within the system? How is it today is something we need to look at. The fourth principle that comes out from the Deuteronomy passage that we have been studying as a church is Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 18, which is the theme of wealth creation. Now, I wanted to emphasize this theme of wealth creation because in business and in money development and in growth, economic growth, wealth creation is quite important. And part of this comes from sociologists elsewhere who have written about this on the Protestant ethic of hard work, of honesty, of real toil, that you can grow money, you can invest it. You don't need to cheat to grow or get a bright idea, to sell, to trade, to invest. and things of this sort. So wealth creation is an important principle. And in Deuteronomy 8:18, the theme is don't forget that it's God who gives you the ability to create the wealth. And it is in God we trust when we look at money and not trust money in itself, because then we lose sight of God in prosperity and wealth. So wealth creation is an important aspect of the good society that God's giving us in the use of the natural resources, in the environment, in the sustainable management of the resources, and there are other passages as well beyond Deuteronomy. Last weekend, Pastor Daniel developed Deuteronomy chapter 15 from the theme of generosity. The theme in this is related to wealth distribution. Pastor spoke about poverty and inequality, and the Deuteronomy passage brings out the theme that the vision of God is that there should be no poor in the land that the Lord is giving. However, the reality is that the poor will be with you always. So it's a kind of a paradox and a contradiction within the passage with God's vision and the reality and the challenges that God's people need to give generously. But when it comes to a nation, then the nation has to develop equitable policies so that those at the bottom end will not suffer. Their lands will not be taken away, or they would not be cheated because they don't have the political power or clout. And so equitable distribution, fairness, is an important aspect of governing the resources. If some have more, then they are responsible to give. And so in a nation state, this is done through taxation, it's done through other forms, but somehow the world is seeing that the top 10, 20% their incomes are growing much faster than the bottom 40%. And often we say, oh, this is laziness, they are not hardworking. But then if we really look at the issues of poverty, there's a lot of injustice, there's a lot of creative taking of assets of the poor. And this is something, a lot is being written now, especially on indigenous land rights and things of this sort. Sixthly, the principle that comes out to us is an inclusive society. And this is found in Deuteronomy chapter 14. So it's not just our government policy or policy of other countries that we should be inclusive. Deuteronomy had the principle that you must not forget the alien. This alien is not from outer space or something. It's just a foreigner in the land. Now, if we just walk around KL, in some parts of our city, there might be more foreigners. Actually, you got Bangladeshis, Pakistanis, Myanmaris, Nepalis, and in some sectors of industry, they've totally taken over in running things. But they are aliens, so they are foreigners in the land. So is it an exploitive system? Is it justice and fairness? Are we truly ASEAN in the way we are developing, that we are building a one community? Because 2015 is the target for an ASEAN community. But the way people are treating Myanmaris or Rohingya or Vietnamese, especially the poor, is not as equal partners. So this is something in building an inclusive society. It's not just among Malays, Indians, Chinese. It's ensuring that Sabahans, Sarawakians, Orang Aslis within the nation state of Malaysia, but also the others who are working and toiling and building the land. Look at all the construction that's going on. So sometimes I wonder where the Malaysians are. No? We all are quite relaxed, but the other guys are really working hard, and in some die in the process of our construction works. Inclusive society. And finally, the vision verse 7, Deuteronomy 1, verse 25, is that the land that the Lord has placed us in is a good land. It's a good land. It is a good land that the Lord your God is giving us. For some historical reason, not just an accident of history, it's God's purpose that we are here in this land. This is a fantastic, great land. I've written my book, and I'm also trying to sell it, not to make any money. This is a book on faith in society. And one interesting thing about this book is Rose co-wrote this with me, and there is a whole chapter on our travels. And this will be interesting because the number of trips that we made together outside and the number of countries that we have visited is quite amazing over the years. But in all these travels, or where I studied in India for more than 5 years in the formative period, and I write about that in my book, or I did my postgraduate studies in England and lived at Oxford, outskirts of Oxford in a place called Kitlington, and then traveled into Oxford Brookes University for a number of years doing my PhD work. But nothing like Malaysia. So Malaysia is a great land, is a good land, and that is something we need to look at. So if the Bible has a clear vision of a society governed by certain principles, and this is either revealed through a dream, through a vision, through the pronouncements of Moses, how then does it apply to us in Malaysian society? So what is the vision in Malaysian society is the next main theme that we want to look at. And Dr. Mahathir on February 28, 1991, 23 years ago, gave a speech on the 9 challenges of Vision 2020. I sometimes marvel because when recently you hear Dr. Mahathir speak, he might have forgotten the speech that he gave 23 years ago. And so I'm purposely reminding, I don't think he will be listening to this sermon, but I want to remind us of the 9 challenges, because the challenges in itself are actually very well thought of. It's comprehensive, it is holistic, it is something we as a nation want to move. And if you look at the Bible verses that I referred to earlier, and then you compare it with the vision and our response, you will see many overlaps, although no Bible verses were given 23 years ago when this speech was read out. The first challenge is establishing a united Malaysian nation made up of one Bangsa Malaysia. The whole idea of unity in diversity, that we would be one nation. Just imagine the kind of talk just in the last 12 months. How far or how wide we are moving away. And we only got 6 more years for 2020. And many of us will live to cross the 2020 year. Second, creating a psychologically liberated, secure, and developed Malaysian society. Psychologically secure. Just listen to speeches, how people are so insecure today. Oh, he's going to take it, he's going to grab your land, he's going to do this, everything is going. Or, some alien is coming. So, liberated, secured. The whole notion of a developed society is not just in infrastructure and all, it's in the psychological preparedness of the nation. And this is important. We are proud, we are prepared, we are skilled, and so forth. It then goes on. Challenge 3, fostering and developing a matured democratic society. Many people think we are falling far short of democratic society. The way Sedition Act and the things that are going on, the call for the return of the ISA, and all these points that are emerging, the restrictions that people are seeing. We did shift, but is it moving towards a democratic society, which was a vision? And this is something that we need to look at. 4, fully moral and ethical society. What is the position of ethics in society? We're not to be one of the most corrupted countries around. So corruption is only not one party, it's two parties. There's some giver and some taker as well. Although we have so many institutions, the perception of corruption and the reality of corruption is a major issue in our society. So going back not just to the 10 Commandments, going back to our own vision of integrity and things of this sort. Now, 5th, matured, liberal and tolerant society. Are we more tolerant today as Malaysians? Are you more tolerant yourself? I think it's something to examine, no? Because we have the idea of one Malaysia which is moving away from tolerance, acceptance and appreciation. We are moving into a deeper understanding of ethnic relations. Liberal, are we a liberal society? They all said, no, we are very conservative, we are very traditional. Liberal society, liberal in the sense is that you're open, not too open. I'm not talking of what took place by the beach in Penang. Not that kind of openness, because we still believe in some morality in that sense. Then we look at scientific and progressive society. We're struggling with the use of English, we're struggling with maths and science, we are falling behind in primary and secondary school competitiveness, using international benchmarks. Our universities are not matching up within that context. We're really struggling, although there are great things in this land. I still believe it's a good land. But these are the issues. Fully caring society, I think a lot of civil society, voluntary organization, government is giving out 500 ringgit as caring to the poor and other assistance. Ensuring economic just society, economic justice, addressing equality. I think there are many initiatives. While there are problems, poverty has really come down in the country. Overall quality of life has gone up in Malaysian society. So there are some positive aspects towards this. And 9, to be a prosperous society, economy that is fully competitive, dynamic, robust, resilient. So based on these 9 indicators, based on the 7 principles of the Deuteronomy passage on the vision that was revealed for God's people and the 9 principles, how do we evaluate contemporary Malaysian society? Where have we been and where are we going in this process? Are we closer to achieving or further away? What are our achievements? What are our hurdles? Have we shifted from our vision? Are we having different visions as people and communities? And I think this is something very important for us to reflect upon. And I come to my 3rd main point on vision and our response. What then is our role? Is our role in fostering this vision, depending on what vision we are talking about? If we want to, as it were, follow the vision of 2020, which is a very important public policy statement, if we take the 7 principles of the Old Testament, including the 10 Commandments, how then do we move as citizens? Will we be active? Will we be passive? Will we be dynamic or indifferent? Will we be responsible or irresponsible in this process? Would we draw on the 7 principles and the 9 challenges? Would we stand by? And I brought my federal constitution as well. I encourage every Christian to buy a federal constitution and read it up, because this constitution sometimes is being interpreted by politicians or civil society people in wrong ways. So you actually don't know what they are saying, and we think it's right. But if we follow the principles of the federal constitution, I think we will be stronger, but all of us need to know it if we are citizens of this land. So the federal constitution is fundamental in this process. And I remember at DUMC, Pastor Daniel and I led a workshop once under the Citizens Network to understand this. But this is a balancing document on religious freedom, Article 3, because it says freedom of religion, or Islam is the religion of the Federation. It's not stated official religion of the Federation, but other religions, but other faith. In the context of language, which is in Article 152, it's the national language, it's the Malay language, but other languages, community languages, can be used, not for official, but for other purposes, and federal and state funding could be allocated for the promotion of other languages. Article 153, which is the most controversial one, but it is there, it is part of the social contract, which is the special position of the Malays in the 3 places, but it is balanced with the legitimate interests of other communities. Anyone who fights for 153 has to fight for both sides of the paragraph. So if you just read part 1 of the paragraph and leave the second part, then it's not consistent. Anyone arguing for 153, for or against it, has to take both it together. But central to this is Article 4, because the supremacy of the federal constitution is the supreme law of the nation. No one else can take it out, because that's part of the 1957, and Article 8, which is an article on equality. Even if you have 153, if you have all the other provisions, it has to be read in the context of Article 8, which is equality of citizens, and how then that is translated and governed. But in having said all this, I think it's important, because some commentators have said Article 10 has the provision for the Sedition Act. So we need to know that within the Constitution, there's provision that you cannot question religion, race, monarchy, the special position in the way that the Constitution has defined it. You can raise issues in terms of implementation, but not the core. We can discuss this later. There is also the provision of Article 149 and 151, which is on emergency and also preventive detentions. The provision is there. The government has repealed the ISA. There is a great call by certain sections for it to be reintroduced. So these are the struggles within that context. But the federal constitution is one, and you need to keep the focus on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is what is being governed at the global level. Malaysia has made a lot of commitments at the international and regional level, and the UDHR, which is fundamental in Article 1, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. This is something we should stand by, whether it's an alien, foreigner, widow, orphan, whoever in society who is different from us ethnically, gender, geographical location. We need to stand along because they are fellow human beings in this journey. So what then is our response? And for our response, and in closing, I have 5 basic points that we can apply this vision from the Bible, the reality of the Malaysian struggle and contestation, and how then do we move on. I think what the nation needs are actually moderate voices. I believe that the people in DUMC are part of the moderate voice. Yes or no? Yes or no? Oh, very soft. Okay, we are part of the moderate voice. We are part of a community of 4,000 people. And extreme voices are there in our society, pulling history, political position, a position of religion, and all issues. And it's important, even at the global level. I think if one just was watching CNN or BBC this morning or yesterday, you would see the promotion of violence, hate, and how global forces are coming to terms with global forces that are at work in our world. And likewise, our role to keep this balance of the federal constitution, raise the principles of Rukun Negara, and raise the principles of Vision 2020. The principles and policies are clear. Somewhere we are going off track, and God's people need to play the role of restraining evil and what is bad. Matthew 5, verse 13 and 14, the salt and light passage, provides the best illustration and challenge for us to play this role as a moderate voice. I told you about my book, and I'll come back to this book again, because within this book, I've highlighted how I moved in my life as a young man from a small town called Banting, which is out closer to Morib, and how I moved from primary, secondary, Form 6, and then went to India for my pastoral training, served as a pastor for 5 years, and how then, after that, I joined Malaysian Care, and then went to do my doctoral work, and then moved on to work in public policy arena, and eventually into the university. I draw this God's leading, and that's why it's faith in society, how my faith took me into society, as well as my faith in our society, that Malaysians are reasonable people and moderate people, and that if society, there is faith that this society can progress. And that's the message that comes out through the book in the various themes that I'm highlighting over this. So the moderate voice and some of the things that I've written over the period of time is illustrated in this. And in another point on public advocacy, many of the themes come out. So don't leave today without buying a copy, okay? But that's just a thought. Now, a moderate voice is important, and it's possible. You can have a moderate voice and keep quiet and sit in your house. But a moderate voice is something that needs to be made known to someone beyond yourself, either through your group, through other forms, to make known what you are happy with or unhappy with in the way the nation is going. And this can be conveyed. Of course, it can be conveyed during the ballot box, but then you have the 4 or 5 years of governance, and it needs to be conveyed. So there are public opinion polls, there's letters to the editor, they might not write it, but if 1,000 people write to the editor, they get actually an idea. But whether people who would voice out the moderate position is important. Secondly, we need Malaysians who will champion, who are not ethnic champions, but who will champion the rich diversity of religion, culture, language, and ethnicity. I think it's championing being Malaysian. I know sometimes it's an unfair question. Are you Malaysian first? Are you Indian first? Are you Christian first? We all have multiple identities. Like a father might be a son, The father might also be a grandfather, he's also a husband, he's also a brother. So we have multiple identities, and our root ethnicity or religion is something you cannot run away. You cannot run away from the fact that I must be of some origin from South India. I'm categorized as Indian, but technically I'm not Indian because my grandparents came from Sri Lanka. But it was only when I turned 50 that I visited the village of my grandparents and went to the ancestral home in an island that was being protected by the Sri Lankan Navy because they were all dangerous people in that island. It's an island called Karnagar. Rose and I went and we were asked so many questions why we were coming to this island by the Navy. So it's within this context that we begin to see our own roots when we visited my place. And last year with Rose, I went to her village, Kutian, in southern China. Of course, I was the only Indian or Indian looking. It was so cold and I had this black, thick coat on with my muffler and all. And they were wondering, the people in the village were wondering whether I was a fortune teller, a money lender, because I was always carrying a book to read because I could not speak the dialect of the people at that time. But our roots are important. We need to know where we have come from. But as a nation, we are more than just our ethnic background. We have religion, we have culture, we have richness of ethnicity, music, dance, food, all kinds of things that symbolizes the richness. But we have too many ethnic champions. I'm not saying it's wrong to argue out for grievances like the Orang Asli land, the Sabah Sarawakian opportunities for education, many of the Indian issues. But we can also look at cross-cultural championing, and that would be very strong in our focus in our time. Now, let me introduce another book that I got. The other day was my birthday on September the 3rd, Wednesday last week. And we had a little party, and I also launched my book that day. And one of the gifts, of course, I like is books that are given to me. I think I got more than 20 books from different people, and I'm keeping it all in the hall, trying to read them. And yesterday, I took up this book, and incidentally, this was given to me by Dato Ambiga, who came for the event. It's a very interesting book entitled Good Morning, Mr. Mandela. It's written by, then she was a young lady. She was 24 years old when she started working for Nelson Mandela. And she worked for him till his death because she carried on from the presidency. She worked with him for 19 years. But she was white. She was an Afrikaner white. And she called Nelson Mandela Kuhulu or Madiba, and she called him grandfather and called Nelson's wife Grace mum. So it's a very fascinating story of a white young girl who started her career as a typist, went on as the personal secretary to the president, one of the secretaries to the president of South Africa, and ended as his personal assistant, and then worked on in the foundation. So in the book, she writes in the beginning part, there's a quote from this famous, not so famous, but famous man called Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe. And Robert Mugabe said, "Nelson Mandela is too much of a saint. He has been too good to white people at the expense of blacks in his own country." And one of the things that this young lady, Zelda, writes is that at the point of Nelson's death, the fear of the white people in South Africa was this big clash that might emerge in the possible killing of whites after Nelson's period. But then raises this question: here's a young white girl that a black president had selected and worked with him for 19 years. And this is her response to too good to white people. But I want to believe that he felt proud of how he changed this insightful life, referring to her. He often said that if you can change one person for the better, you have done your duty. And this is how she then is indebted to the way Nelson Mandela changed her whole outlook to life. And then your duty is to work with human beings as human beings, not because you think they are angels. That means people are human beings and treat all, and that's something she learned. He has not only changed my life, this is what this young lady, who is now 44 years old, is saying, but millions of others. He has done way beyond what is expected of a single human being, and perhaps for that he will deserve to be hailed as a saint after all. So here is someone who is a young white working under the black president, who is immensely transformed in her outlook and her championing, and she becomes a champion of the new South Africa. It's the same. Is God raising a champion among us for Malaysians as a whole? Thirdly, God calls us to be bridge builders, not one who creates hurdles and divisions in society. In the Sermon on the Mount, there is the emphasis of peace. We are peace builders. In the Ephesians 2:14 passage, there is the call of breaking down the dividing walls of hostility. And possibly as bridge builders, God is calling possibly our cell groups to establish stronger community base. I know as Christian community we are meeting regularly, but how then beyond evangelism we are reaching to the local community? Do we know the residents association? Do we know the imam or the ustaz at the mosque? Do we know the sergeant at the balai nearby? Or do we know the PIBG leaders at the school? Because we need bridge builders to society. And this has a very strategic role in the long run, because if there's any problem on the ground, you know who are your friends, who are your neighbors, who are the people that you can turn to in any crisis situation in due time. So bridge building is important. Fourthly, a theme that our church has been highlighting very strongly is actually prayer warriors. Whether in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2, the call to pray for leaders and the nation as a whole is important, or in the Habakkuk 2:1 passage, where it calls this idea of a watchman who is standing up and looking at the scenario and the seasons, so they will know how best to pray. And prayer warriors are necessary, because in this nation, it's not just a fight, a human fight, it's also a fight against principalities and powers. And finally, to be public advocates and public intellectuals. One of the things that I've done over the time in my life, because I shifted from theology or divinity into sociology and public policy. Many people go the other way, from secular studies into theology. I went from theology into secular studies. And one of the things is actually in the public arena, and write about this in my book, because since 2008, I organized 62 roundtable discussions and brought up something like 30 books and booklets, published over 75 articles, and been quoted over 90 articles, which are all recorded in this book. Somebody might say, okay, what's so great about all this? The problem is still severe in the country. But nonetheless, I think there needs to be more advocates emerging. And this is why I think it's important for us to note that young people and parents often want their kids to go into accountancy, architecture, business, or more professional medical, other sorts, engineering, these sort of fields. So the fields that are neglected and the fields that are actually under domain and controlling the public space, like what? History. So why would a parent want their son or daughter to study history? How much money can you make as a historian? So we have neglected it. But history is at the heart of contestation. If we got some of our better, brighter young people to study history, they might make it as a professor of history or a school teacher with history. But history is so important because whether non-Malays played a role in independence or not is a historical debate. And history in its original study or in other aspects of rewriting. I said this to somebody yesterday, that when I visited Setiawan with Rose and went to the museum the church had set up, the museum is that the whole town was named after the pastor. I think it's the pastor's road or the pastor's house that was the center of the whole town. Now, of course, this is part of the Christian heritage and tradition, but it should become the heritage of the whole nation, that's how the town developed. So for this, you need historians who are academically competent, who can then articulate it and write it. People in literature, people in politics, political science, people in economics, people in sociology, people in anthropology, people in psychology, people in social work. These terrains which actually dominate public policy, there are very few Christians actively involved in these fields. And even young people who might consider career choices should consider some of these fields and even consider joining the civil service. Because at one time, whether it was Joseph in the Old Testament or Daniel in the Old Testament, they were all key civil servants who played a key role. And it's a very dynamic and powerful role. And we have withdrawn from that space. And so as public advocates and public intellectuals, we need to move into these areas in order to ensure that the land and the community has this as a strength. And so I think what we have seen this morning through this sharing is the 7 principles from the Deuteronomy passage, where looked at the 9 challenges and their 5 responses. How would we make Malaysia a better Malaysia? How would we act to restrain people who are trying to destroy it in some way, trying to create it in their own way? How would we hold on both to the Bible, the Constitution, to Vision 2020, to the Rukun Negara, and then say, we are builders of this nation, that we will have the vision and the ability to construct or help build a nation that is good for all Malaysians. Let us look to him in prayer and call upon him.
Thank you, Dr. Denison. As we close.